Hi everyone, this is the video introduction for Wednesday, April 29th, and today we'll be discussing and reading Chapter 7, which is called Shifting Baselines. It's a very important chapter because the concept of shifting baselines comes up again and again in this book. So, today's a quick one. There's only two things you need to know about Chapter 7. Now remember, when we left off in Chapter 6, we were introduced to this new endangered species, the Lang's metalmark butterfly, and we were introduced to its habitat, its friend, the buckwheat plant, its enemy, the hairy vetch, and John and his friends actually counted the butterfly, and they only reached a peak count of 28. So remember, that means that this endangered butterfly, there's only 28 of them left on this planet, potentially. So when we get to Chapter 7, what you really need to understand are two things. The first is that Chapter 7 is really a history chapter. They go through the history of a modern butterfly hunter named Leon O'Brien. Then they go back in time and talk about the history of butterflies in California, James Cottle. They talk about Harry Lang, who the butterfly was named after. So most of this chapter is just the history of the Antioch Dunes and sort of the history of butterfly counting and butterfly observing in general. Then, a little more than halfway through, we're introduced into the second really important thing in this chapter, and that is shifting baseline syndrome. So what that means in common English is that we as humans really see the world according to baselines that we grew up with. So I think the best example is sort of the ocean, okay? If you talk to a modern scientist about how many fish are in the ocean, they're probably going to say there's not as many left. There's not as many codfish, there's not as many whales. When he started his career, there were this many, now there's this many. However, if you go back a few hundred years, there were much more fish. So why didn't the scientists mention that? It's because of shifting baseline syndrome. It's because scientists measure wildlife according to the baselines they grew up with. Children today are going to measure nature and wildlife according to what they grew up with. None of us can really see the whole story, this whole hundreds and thousands of years story playing out, because our memories don't go back that far. We sort of inherit these baselines we grew up with for how much forest there's supposed to be in Georgia, and for the rest of our lives we compare everything to that. If you were able to go back 500 years and look at the forests in Georgia, you would be stunned at the amount of trees and their height and their thickness. So shifting baseline syndrome means that no one really sees the whole story. We all sort of measure change according to the baselines we grew up with, which is kind of a sad thing and kind of a problem for ecologists who are trying to assess these species like the Lang's metalmark, but it's not always easy to find a baseline to compare to. So that was the second important thing in the chapter. They talk about the Pleistocene rewilding. That's a pretty weird concept. At the end, we're introduced to Dr. Powell and his sort of cynicism and negativity, and that's where Chapter 7 ends. So enjoy it. Happy reading today.